Yes, he did.
Donnybrook is made possible by the members of the 9 Network.
Well, thanks for joining us for another edition of Donnybrook. Great to have you with us. Lots to talk about, and a special guest on the second half, Paul Ziegler, who is the CEO of Education Plus, formerly known as the Cooperating School District. We'll be talking about Education 2020 style. But first, let's meet our panelists, shall we? She's the news director for the Big 550, KTRS, Wendy Wiese. Along with Mr. Bill McClellan, who, of course, writes for the St. Louis Post-Dispatch. And we have Ray Hartmann, who writes for the St. Louis Riverfront Times. And, of course, you hear him on KTRS. And from the St. Louis American, we have Mr. Alvin Reid. And we have a special deal for our Donnybrook viewers. If you go to World News, you can get both the St. Louis American and the RFT for free if you mention my name. Okay, we're going to start then with you, Bill McClellan.
There's a joke in that, people. There's a joke.
We need a laugh track, Charlie.
It's a big night. It's a lame attempt at humor. Very lame. Bill, I hope you don't find it humorous that the governor and his lovely wife, Teresa Parson, have COVID-19. They announced that yesterday. She has mild symptoms. He is asymptomatic. Some people are saying, I told you so. You should have taken the darn thing seriously. How do you feel about this?
Well, I would like to be really gracious at a moment like this, Charlie, and I certainly hope that both Mr. and Mrs. Parson recover completely and, get through this very clearly. But it is a little snickerish. I mean, when the governor who talked about, that dang mask, and likes to play up to Trump and appears places without a mask on, and then he gets COVID-19. There is a little bit of like, oh my, que sera, sera or something. So, I wish the governor well, but it's hard to be as gracious as I'd like to be.
Is it called Schadenfreude? Is that what it's called?
That's a good word for it. Yes, it is.
I think that's the word.
Yeah,
go ahead, Alvin.
No, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to cut you off, Wendy. I'm sorry. Go ahead. No, I was just going to say, the late John Lennon, and the song said, "Instant karma's going to get you." And in part, I'm hesitant to say that because I don't want karma to get me. My family so far has been blessed not to have to, deal in it, especially my mom. And so I don't want to snicker, but I think we all had the same reaction when we first heard or read that there's been a lot of tough talk, and now the talk in response has to be genteel and wish, the governor and his wife the best. And I'll just add this too. Of all the really tough talkers on TV, on radio, in comments section, I wish they had to take that tough talk to somebody who lost somebody to the COVID virus. So, I think that puts things in a little bit more perspective in the state of Missouri. We'll just leave it like that.
First of all, I genuinely do hope, I think everybody does, that they're fine. I mean, this is
genuinely hope that, right? Come on.
Yeah.
No, I do hope they're fine. And by the way, he has a lot of comorbidities. I don't know if people remember, he had heart surgery right after he got elected lieutenant governor, and he was able to take office shortly after in 2017. So he's got some comorbidities, and we do want to wish him well. But I'll say this, that last week he was called out for the cost of the special session, and his response was to point to the 191 murders in St. Louis and the 130 in Kansas City and say, that's what we should be talking about. And you know what he didn't mention is the 1,952, as we went on tonight, 1,952 people who have died of COVID-19 in our state. That's a lot more. That's 6 times more than the two cities combined. And we all know how high that murder rate is. 6 times more than Kansas City and St. Louis combined homicides. And he and Mrs. Parson are among 120,000 Missourians who have gotten this very dangerous virus. And so I think that, if anything, we ought to be talking more and more about the Republicans' failure nationally to deal with this virus.
I wish them both a speedy recovery, but what I think this does do is bring into very sharp focus how much we still don't know about COVID and why we should all be as careful and as prudent as possible when it comes to following the guidelines that some people are so flagrantly violating.
Well, Ray, couldn't he say to you, where is your column about the homicides in the city, where we've had 200 so far this year? And
2 weeks
that's the
ago, I wrote
highest in
about
25 years. And today it was reported in the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, I think by Aaron Heffernan, that unbelievably 185 kids have received care at 2 hospitals for pediatric gunshot wounds in 2020 alone. I mean, I think he's right to bring that.
If he asked me that, I would point him to the one I wrote 2 weeks ago. I mean, I happen to think...
What, on decreasing homicides in the city?
Yes, because we need gun control in the city, and that absolutely I wrote about it. I wrote about it in that context, that we need to do something. We are not going to police our way out of the murder problem in the city, the tragic murder problem in the city of St. Louis. We've got to do the things we talked about after the George Floyd murder, some of the reforms, and we got to talk about controlling guns. We've got to stop criminalizing poverty.
How do you control guns with criminals, Ray? With people who don't care about violating the law? We need what? We need few. Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
That's one solution, not the solution. But you're asking what I say to it. You've got to get to the cause of the crime problem.
I'm sorry I missed that column. I think I must have been on vacation because I missed that one. Okay. Thank you, sir. I extend my apologies to you and the Riverfront Times. I want to ask you, Wendy, about Steve Savard. He's out as the main anchor at KMOV, a cost-cutting move by management there that also took the jobs of several of Steve's colleagues. And it was reported today that Tim Eby, the general manager at St. Louis NPR, that's KWMU, has been let go. And someone from Littleton, Colorado will be taking his job on an interim basis. There were employees of color who had complained that management and donors had mistreated them. And Eby, who I think spent 12 years at KWMU, is no longer affiliated with the organization. Savard, Eby, take your pick. Wendy?
I was frankly surprised. I don't want anyone at any time to lose their position. But in the aftermath of the Don Marsh fiasco, I was kind of surprised that Tim Eby lived to tilt at another windmill after that. So when this group of women of color at KWMU, people of color at KWMU raised their voices together and directed it into Mr. Eby's office, I knew that he was on borrowed time. So I wish him the very best, and I hope that he learns from the lessons of KWMU. Steve Savard was a shock, but I suppose only in that he's been a part of the media landscape here for such a long time, such a highly visible part, not only as a sportscaster, but now as an anchor for all of these years. J.D. Sosnoff and I worked together at KMOX, Charlie, as you recall, back when we were both young. And I always knew him to be a very thoughtful guy. So I know that this isn't anything that he did lightly. He came out quickly and said that this had nothing to do with anything that Steve Savard had done. So I think it's a reminder that whether you're in the media, whether you're in manufacturing, whether you work at the corner drugstore, you're blessed and fortunate to have a job today.
Yeah, Bernie Miklasz, Steve, Wendy, yourself, much higher echelon than myself, but myself included. We got asked to step away, and we really didn't do anything, on paper that, so when it happens to somebody else, I understand it. I don't like it, but it's understandable. And especially, me, 2009, and we're many years later, about 11 years later, but we're going through that cycle again where, you're up there in salary and you get replaced. And it happens. I hope Steve stays in St. Louis. Okay. But the problem with that is that maybe he'd be better off someplace else, financially and things like that. But I hope he stays. I stayed. You stayed. I think Bernie will stay. So I hope we stay.
I hate it.
It is two very different cases, though. I mean, Savard is strictly seems to be like an economics thing. Right. And Tim Irby was part of the Cultural Revolution.
Oh, well, I'm not including Tim. I'm not including Tim at all.
I know. I know. You're gracious about that. Yeah. But I mean, Irby's, they put the dunce cap on him and march him down the street. Savard was just dollars and cents.
Yeah.
Well, I got to say, first of all, I think we ought to rename this the "We Wish You Well" edition of Donnybrook. It seems like,
right.
But as someone whose value is mostly archaeological at this point, I have to say that I hated to see with Steve Savard. He's such a nice guy, and he's an institution. And I don't know anything about their finances, but I just didn't like seeing it. I don't know. And Tim, maybe I don't really have much of an opinion. I think people need to, I actually surprised the way people in a lot of markets, the NPR and the PBS station are in one place, and we have the Commons, but we're very different. And a lot of people don't realize it's a part of the University of Missouri, St. Louis. And so it's just a completely different animal. But there's something about, and again, maybe it's there, but for the grace of God goes I or something. But I think it's nice to have some of the folks that, like I say, Steve Savard, I don't feel strongly. He's just a good guy, and I don't think I just think it's unfortunate.
Well, we do wish him well, that's for sure. And I always say, when it comes to those issues, ask not for whom the bell tolls.
Yeah.
So I want to move on to lighter fare, perhaps. Sports in St. Louis County. Alvin, you write about sports for the St. Louis American. And Sam Page has revised the rules this week when it comes to sports and high school athletics. Now, volleyball, along with field hockey and soccer, games can be played. And this announcement was made at the same time. They said that football games can't be played just yet because the county executive feels the level of transmission is a little too high in certain groups in St. Louis County. But at last night's meeting of the St. Louis County Council, they received a whopping 470 plus letters from concerned residents, most of them over this issue. And last week, Parkway Schools, Rockwood Schools, Incarnate Word Academy, and DeSmet all said that they're going to start playing their games outside of the county. So what do you think about these changes, which also say that spectators either have to be limited to 2 per family or no spectators whatsoever, depending on the sport?
Okay, DeSmet said we're going to play football outside the county, but the kids that play football can no longer actually come physically to the school. They have to do online learning. So what does that tell you? Okay. Now, with Incarnate Word and with DeSmet, you can do what you want to, technically, in my opinion, because you're a private school. But I guess Lindbergh is in that group of schools too. Lindbergh, Parkway, Rockwood. You know what this is about? Those superintendents have, with salary and benefits, over 800,000 reasons to cave on this issue. They're feeling the pressure. They want to save their jobs. This has nothing to do with health. This has nothing to do with football. This has to do with their jobs and whether or not they're going to hang on to them after this first contract they're on, or second, current contract they're on. I live in Kirkwood. Hopefully Kirkwood won't crack under this pressure. I would be very, very, very disappointed if they do. As I've said on the show before, this is not about kids getting scholarships. If you're good enough to get a scholarship, you're going to get a scholarship. This is about my parents, my kid's going to be a superstar if I'm a parent, and if I'm a coach, I don't want to lose my salary either, and I'm a wannabe Vince Lombardi. Give it a rest, people. You know, sometimes people have to make tough decisions.
Else?
Well, I think that the county is trying. I'm sorry, Bill. You want to go ahead?
No, you go ahead, Ray.
I think I wouldn't want that job right now to try to call it, because it's not black and white. It's tough. It's a moving. First of all, what people have trouble accepting is that it's a moving target. The numbers change, and it's not
every
like
day.
Every day.
Yeah.
That it's not static. It's moving target. The one thing that's clear from the numbers, at least what I understand, is the 15 to 9 age group is dramatically higher. I think we talked about it last week, than the 10 to 14. So there's some logic in that line that the county drew, which is relaxing things 14 and under. It wasn't just some arbitrary number they picked. It was based on the science. And, you know, I do understand the parents' frustration, and I understand what you're saying, Alvin, too. But I don't think school districts should be going outside of the guidance of the county that they're in, because it is whatever one thinks of the county executive, and I have my issues with them, as you know. I think they're trying to follow the science.
Well, I was going to say that Alvin lost me when he was saying that this is about the parents who, you know, think their kids are going to be superstars and stuff. You know, but my kids who you know, played 8 straight years of high school athletics, and I loved it, were never going to get scholarships, never going to be D1 athletes or anything. But I'd have been really hurt to have like the Jack senior year of soccer taken away, or Lorna's senior year of softball taken away, especially looking around and saying like, well, they're playing over here and they're playing over there. So I can really sympathize with the parents who feel like their kids are missing a year that they'll never get back.
I hear you, Bill, but this is a different circumstance. And under this circumstance, I think being on the overly cautious side is different than being on the underly cautious side. And if the county says we're not ready to go there yet, and think about the reasons they're moving to these other counties. The other counties have proven they don't care. So basically, you're casting a vote for I don't care either. And I just think it's a horrible example. And like I said,
Alvin,
private school, you do what you want. But public school, skirt the rules. Find a way. Forget authority. That's what you're teaching the kids.
Actually, I think those private and parochial schools are under the same health regulations as public schools.
But I'm just saying about the administration. They don't have to answer to anybody except the parents of the kids that go there. The other school districts have to answer to every taxpayer in that school district. Well, and I don't think they're doing that.
I think a lot of people see the value of athletics more than just ego or trying to get into college.
No, wait a minute, Charlie, I know that.
Then why don't you say it?
My entire life. That's what I'm saying.
But here's the deal. But people say, look at the science. The science is, in St. Louis City, not one person under 40 has died from this. And in the county, 2 under 40 have died. But they haven't said what age that is. So for most kids, it's asymptomatic. The key then is to keep the kids away from the older folks and those with comorbidities, right?
Charlie, even though we haven't had fatalities, what we have discussed over the course of the last couple of weeks is the fact that we still don't know about further risk down the road in some child who has been diagnosed with COVID-19. They're talking about possible heart and lung issues. And I think that is something that everybody has to think about. It's not death or nothing.
Yeah, and I understand what you're saying. And in that case, I think that, like many other behaviors in life, it should be up to the parents and the kids. And if, let's say, and that's a legitimate concern, if you think that your kid could be at risk of some myocardial infraction in the future, then maybe he or she shouldn't be playing. But that may not be the decision of all families.
Well, wait a minute now, Charlie. Most kids in high school who have sex don't get pregnant or don't get a transmitted disease. So that means it's okay to have sex? I mean, think about it, Charlie. You're saying like, oh, you won't die or nothing will happen to you. So,
well, you're the guy who wants marijuana, spread throughout the land, right? And gambling and other areas of life.
That's Bill and me. Wait a minute. That's Bill and me. Get that right.
Well, I think that Alvin is part of the Vice Club as well.
We were on that before Alvin was on the show. Come on.
First of all, if you got enough money to gamble with or 15, that's different. Okay.
But, let's move on to Ray. Ray, your friend and mine, Roy Blunt, senior senator from the great state of Missouri, does want a vote on a Trump nominee for the Supreme Court that was made available after Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg passed away last Friday. This is the same senator who wouldn't give Merrick Garland a meeting back in 2016. What are you going to say about this one, Ray?
Well, I mean, the Republicans are really playing with fire, I think. They have a tough call to make, which I don't think they've made yet, which is whether they want to jam this through before the election or take their chance doing it in the lame duck session. And I did a little piece today for on a national website about the fact that this is really being misinterpreted by people as a national question, when in fact it's very different state by state. So a state like Florida, for example, using Pew Center numbers, is much more pro-choice dramatically than a lot of other states, even though it's a red state. Montana is as pro-choice as California. This isn't, and so it could affect the Senate seat there. This is hard to call what the politics are. I think it will be very energizing to the pro-choice side, as much as I don't want to see it happen if they rush a justice through before the election. And I think this is I think they're playing with fire. As far as Roy, I'm very disappointed, obviously, in Senator Blunt, because the hypocrisy of this is so obvious to people. You just can't have it both ways. You can't say, and they did say in 2016, in February, it's too close to the election, let the voters decide. You just can't square those two positions.
Well, how about people with your position? If in 2016 you thought that Merrick Garland should have had a hearing, then why not a hearing for the Trump nominee?
Because it was in February. This is literally after people are voting in this election. I mean, I actually think, believe it or not, as I say, I don't want to see Trump make another one of these, and we've politicized the court so badly, and I'm really not interested in the talk about,
it was politicized before 2016, like Ray.
But what? No, in 16, there was no excuse. Look, the Republicans fought President Obama from the day he walked into office. The reason that Harry Reid went nuclear in 2013, as they say, and eliminated the filibuster on federal judges was because they sat on 4 years of federal judges. So the Republicans played rugged on this, dirty really, on judges, and there was no excuse or precedent for them not to.
I thought the Republicans were wrong in 2016.
They were wrong.
And I think they have, that conversely, they have every right to get a nominee and push her through now. I mean, the president appoints, the Senate confirms, and the Republicans, there was no excuse for what Mitch McConnell did in 2016, but this is it might be hypocritical. It is hypocritical. But they have the right to do it now.
I'm not arguing that point.
But I put myself in the situation where I think to myself, okay, first, one of the things about why did they put up with Donald Trump? And what is this really all about? And I think it has always been about Ruth Bader Ginsburg and whether she survives the 4 years of his, his first term. And she did not. And I think that is why they have put up with him. And now they find it, boy, right now. And I think they said, like, we have no choice but to go forward. Okay. And then I think about myself, which is, if I had been Republican, Democrat, whatever side it was in 2016, and I was blabbing on TV and radio and the newspapers, they'd call me in right now and say, hey, loudmouth, how you going to vote on this? And I'm a Republican. I say, hey, loudmouth, how you going to vote? I'm going to say, I'm going to vote that we go and get this done as quickly as possible, because all indications are there might be a lame duck president between now and then after the election. So, look, I don't like it. It is hypocritical. I also will say to Senator Blunt that a lot of people, when they talk about you as opposed to your junior senator, they always start out, well, he's an honorable man and he's this and he's that. Well, I'm going to judge you on your behavior, which is not really good right now. It's hypocritical. But I understand why everybody's falling in line. Quite frankly, Donald Trump is president because Republicans fell in line. They can't stand the man.
Right. And Roy Blunt has been, in my mind, I was really wrong because I thought he would be more of the kind of Senator guardrail than he has been. At one point early on in the administration, he sort of brokered the deal on keeping the government open. And I thought I had high hopes because I happen to like him personally. And as opposed to Josh Hawley, who's just, well, whatever. But the point is, I think you're right, Alvin. It's been very disappointing because
I got to tell you something.
It's just so hard for them. They're so worried about getting on in the sites of Trump's Twitter feed.
I do want to say one thing about Hawley. This is called provocateur privilege. Give me 10 seconds. He has been concerned about social media, and there is a great movie on Netflix right now called The Social Dilemma. I hope everybody watches it, and that's my message. Now, let's go to our final topic with just 2 minutes to go in this broadcast before we get to the second half when we talk about schools with Paul Ziegler. Bill McClellan, I want to ask you about the Cole County judge who today ruled that getting an envelope notarized is not an obstacle for a mail-in ballot. It's a little unusual. Not all states have that, not too many. But in Missouri, for some voters, if you want a mail-in ballot, you have to get the envelope notarized. What did you think about that decision?
Well, I thought it was a bad decision. And you know, obviously I'm not a lawyer and I haven't read the briefs or anything, but I think it is a barrier to voting if you have to take your your ballot and go find a notary and have the notary in and have it signed. That can be a difficult thing to do, especially for a poor person without a car. So I read that and I winced. I mean, I think that you can do mail-in balloting safely without having people have to go find a notary.
And we always have.
And you're
we
right,
always
Bill,
had
that's
the
a hardship.
FBI. The FBI director was in front of Congress today, from Congress today, that said that there's never been any evidence of voter fraud. And so, period. And mail-in voting is not subject to voter fraud.
Right. Always remember,
Donald Trump's mind.
Well, don't forget that Berkeley Mayor Ted Haskins is up on federal charges right now on voter fraud. But go ahead, Alvin.
All right, but just real quick. Don't hate the player, hate the game. If you're a notary, you got a problem with it, set up between now and the last day that you can vote by mail. Be in every community center, be everywhere. It doesn't cost you anything. You're a notary, you can notarize something, help out. Get out there, help people, and just get the job done. It's too late now to really argue. Get the job done, folks.
That's all the time we have for this. Thanks for everybody's opinion. Stand by, one and all, because Paul Ziegler from Education Plus, formerly known as the Cooperating School Districts, joins us on Donnybrook Part 2.
Donnybrook is made possible by the members of the 9 Network. Donnybrook is made possible by the members of the 9 Network.
Well, thank you so much for joining us for the second half, and we are pleased and proud to welcome Dr. Paul Ziegler from Education Plus. He's the CEO there. That's the organization formerly known as the Cooperating School District. It's a congregation of school districts in the county and maybe beyond who pool their efforts and resources. And Dr. Ziegler is the former superintendent of the Northwest R1 School District in Jefferson County. Dr. Ziegler, thanks for joining us on this edition of Donnybrook. How are you?
Doing great, and thanks for having me. I really appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you so much. We appreciate it. Maybe you could tell our viewers a little something about your organization.
Well, Education Plus is a cooperative of 53 area school districts. We range as far north as Ellsbury, as far south as south of Festus, and as far west as Warrenton, Washington. So we kind of cover everything in between all the way to St. Louis City.
Wendy?
Dr. Ziegler, this has been such a difficult time for families, certainly for school superintendents, navigating their way through what we hope will be our first and last pandemic of our lifetimes. But is there any light that you can shed on the just the fluidity and the differences that we're seeing from one district to the next, and obviously county boundaries that plays into it. But it is confusing for the layperson, and I just wondered, as an educator, if you could help us understand what seems to be impossible to understand in this sort of patchwork quilt.
Yeah, so it's been a challenge, obviously, across the region. You see a variety of different approaches for school districts, and some of it is kind of based on communities and what their tolerance is and what their expectations are. And some of it's politics, obviously, but really all of our districts have tried to approach it from a standpoint of how we keep kids and staff safe and move into an environment where kids can learn. And it's taken different forms, obviously, and really it's been fluid throughout the time. You know, when we started back in March with this and we rolled out into a virtual environment, really the focus of all the superintendents was, how do we do this the best we can? How do we enter into this virtual environment we weren't all that prepared for and tried to deliver some sort of meaningful education? As we rolled out of that and went into the summer, really began to focus on how do we bring kids back? And we knew that would be difficult, but I'll tell you, in June, we were feeling pretty good. You could see it on the superintendent's faces. They were kind of feeling like, okay, we're maybe turning a corner. And then we started to see the numbers change in July, and it really caused a lot of the superintendents to pause and look at how the pandemic's affecting their community. And that really caused some of that retraction from that face-to-face kind of hybrid thought pattern to the all virtual. Now, in some of our communities that hadn't seen those spikes as quickly, they did move to a face-to-face environment, and we're beginning to glean some information from that on how our other districts can move forward too.
Bill?
Paul, we say cooperative school districts, but I don't see any cooperation. It seems like everybody, every superintendent, every district is completely independent, where we now have schools from the county going out to St. Charles to play athletics and schools from the city talking about it. Where is the cooperation?
Yeah, I can see where somebody might think that when you look at it from the external. But I'll tell you, for the last 24 weeks, superintendents from the entire region have met on Wednesday mornings from 9, scheduled till 10:30. Sometimes we've been as late as 11:30 going. And theirs is like, just last week, we had over 63 participants in that. We've opened that up to some other people. During that time, we're sharing best practice. We're sharing where our philosophies are, moving our district forward, because each district and each community has a little different set of resources and a little different challenge when it comes to how do we effectively educate children. So that's where you're seeing the differences come out. But as a cohesive group of superintendents, I'm proud with the work they've done and how they've shared and how they've worked together to come back with what are our best practices for bringing kids back to school, what are our best practices for working in a virtual environment, and how do we protect everyone and keep everyone safe. So, I mean, really, there's been a ton of cooperation. It just manifests itself different in each community.
So the schools in this district can go and play in that district. And I mean, it just seems so willy-nilly, but you're saying that everybody's cooperating in this willy-nilly sort of a way?
Yeah, I wouldn't say that there's not tension, because obviously if one community, we're constantly in St. Louis comparing to one another. It's in our nature. It goes back to where'd you go to high school? But one of those things, when you look at it, it's not competitive tension. It's tension because people are doing different things. And that question, we knew it was going to be difficult to make decisions. And we knew communities weren't going to be happy no matter what decision we made. So anytime one community is doing something somebody else in another community would like to be doing, then it creates that tension. So we see that in the athletics. We see that in the virtual or face-to-face. We see that in different times that we're bringing kids back. But cooperatively, the superintendents are sharing every bit of information and every bit of advice that they can together to make sure we're all, doing the best we can for our communities and our kids.
Thank you, Paul.
Mm-hmm.
Doctor, voluntary desegregation changed the face of public education in St. Louis more dramatically, I think, than anything had ever done. How in a post-deseg world, and I realize this might not apply to all 53 of your districts, but how are we doing with regard to, and what are we doing to assure that we're just not going to go back to, well, how are we doing in the area of racial equity and fairness?
It's something we talk about all the time. If anything, the pandemic has shined an even brighter spotlight on the lack of equity across our region. We do have some districts that have significant amount more money and resources than other districts. And each community has its own challenges. For some of our communities, right out of the, into the pandemic, it was really about food insecurity. And our districts worked real hard to make sure we were providing food. Other communities, that wasn't an issue. So as we've navigated through this pandemic, I will tell you the inequities of our region have become more and more apparent. So how do we deal with it? Well, in the short term, we've leaned a lot on some nonprofits and some other folks to help us out. We've used some CARES dollars to try and provide some resources for some of the districts, whether that's connectivity, whether it's food resources, or whether it's some other supports. But long term, that's only a Band-Aid. At some point, we're going to have to address the way schools are funded in the state of Missouri, because right now it's not an equitable situation. They are not funded the same. We're not funded the same in the region, let alone across the state. And while we have the inequities here that we can see as a community, they're statewide, where you have the inequity from one district to the next that may lie in the same county.
You mentioned meaningful education. And it's not just, like I said, not just Black kids, but what percentage of children right now who are not in class are not getting a meaningful education because they just do not have the computer, they do not have the resources, they do not have the family, whatever. Okay, what percentage is that? Because I've heard different percentages. Okay, but if you could, whatever numbers you all have, since you're all cooperating together, what number is that?
Well, and I think there's different in every community. Obviously, some communities are probably better prepared to engage with their students in a virtual environment. Maybe they have a parent that can work from home and be there as a support. So that's going to be different. Now, we range probably from about 40% virtual, where there's a face-to-face option, I should say, from about 40% virtual down to about 20% virtual. That's where parents have made a decision. I have an option to send my child to school, and I decided to keep them virtual. Obviously, when a parent makes a choice to keep virtual, that support may look different than in a district where everyone is virtual and there really wasn't that choice. So in those, one of the things we talked about just yesterday was, what are those strategies for engaging kids when they're not engaging through that virtual environment? So we're really trying to work to find out what have people work. One of the things that I heard just recently were teachers doing drive-by visits to pull into a driveway and say, hey, I'm in your driveway. Can we connect a little bit at an appropriate distance or with social distancing, to try and create those connections for some of our kids? They've never really met their teachers face-to-face this year. There just hasn't, and that's a difficult thing for kids to then connect with an educator. So it's going to be different in every district, and every district has tried to employ some kind of strategies to do that, but we're still struggling in a few areas to make those good connections. And I think the younger children probably struggle more than probably our older kids. So you're probably going to see difference in percentages even from young to old, but we haven't collected a specific number of how many haven't engaged at all or haven't signed in.
Well, Doctor, that was my next question, because I'm concerned about the kindergartners. I just don't see how you can have virtual education by kindergarten. And I'm wondering if historians 20 years from now will say that in the year 2021, first grade was kind of a repeat of kindergarten for a lot of kids in the United States.
Well, I think one of the things is we've recognized that too. And as we've learned more about the virus itself, in its lack of seeming like it affects the little ones as significantly as their older populations, you'll see every school that's in a virtual platform is starting to figure out, how are we going to bring back the youngest ones first? We've already had several districts throughout St. Louis County that have begun to bring back pre-K, K, 1, and 2. We have some that have moved into 3, 4, and 5. And we have some that are already looking at how they bring back middle school students. That varies still community to community based on what their community needs are. And the pandemic's affected communities differently throughout the region. We've continued to see different hot spots where communities have really struggled to deal with the effects of the pandemic, and others where it seems like they've, relatively rolled through it. So again, that's different from place to place, but I think all of our schools are looking at how do we get our little ones back first, because we know that we're struggling there the most.
Dr. Ziegler, you said that you have identified the universal educational community. You have identified a lot of the weaknesses in terms of inequities and that kind of thing, access. How does our region compare to other regions around the country? Do you have that information?
I don't readily available. I would imagine all regions of the country have a similar makeup to St. Louis, where you have some suburbs, you have some urban areas, and you have some rural areas that are closely packed, all have some sort of similar equity issues. Because even though we think typically an equity issue may be, poverty or something else that we create, we also see that in our rural areas around the collar counties of St. Louis. So it's not always just an urban issue or a rural issue. There are some across, and it varies for us, as you might imagine, from one end of the county to the other. And it's same in Jefferson and same in St. Charles County. You see differences even amongst districts where pockets have greater needs than other pockets within the same district. So I don't know how we compare to, say, Indianapolis or somebody, but I would imagine they struggle with similar.
I got a transportation question for you, sir. I remember before school started, people were telling me that the city schools would have a real problem transporting kids to schools because it would be so expensive. You'd need twice as many buses or vans so that the kids could socially distance. Well, that hasn't happened because the kids have been not going to real school. Have you had this problem in the rural school districts where you've had to employ more buses in order to socially distance kids?
One thing we found, it's been a situation where our parents have helped tremendously. The call kind of went out early on. If you're a parent and you can transport your child to school, it'd be great if you could, because it'll give us more space to transport those students that need it. So we have some school districts where 60, 70% of the parents have responded, we'll transport our kid. And they might have done that even without the request, just over concerns of social distancing. Yeah. But that has helped tremendously. Now, the response to that is we have a lot more parents picking up kids and dropping. So that creates its own set of challenges for schools as they drop off and pickups become a more congested situation. But again, it's allowed them to do some things on some school buses that allow that social distancing. Also allows some cohorting of families, because typically if mom can't drive the first grader, they're not going to drive the third grader or the fifth grader, right. But allowing us to cohort some families in portions of the bus so that if they're home together, they're on the bus together. And those type of things have been employed throughout the region and have had some success.
Okay, thank you. Doctor, I got one question that go back to what you were saying earlier about how we need to change how we fund education. One way Missouri funds it is less than just about every other state per capita, certainly in the 40s. Is there a role for an organization like yours to change that? And when you refer to how we need to look at this differently and how inequitable it is, what are some of the solutions? Is it removing the property tax base as such a factor? What are the things you think we should do?
Well, and yes, we are. One of the things we like to say is we're an advocate for public education. So certainly I watch legislation as it goes through Jefferson City. We help other state organizations support, whether those are funding changes or other things. So certainly from that perspective, it's something we do, is to try and advocate for public ed. And a lot of times that is around funding, because we are very low funding, or funded as far as a state. The other piece then, property tax, it drives a lot of the revenue into our school districts. The problem is it's not implemented necessarily consistently across the state. Typically, you've got the large urban centers where there's a lot of property tax, and that generates a lot of revenue for schools. And in response to that, then the state decreases the amount of state funding they get, which allows a lot of the sales tax or other things that may be general revenue for the state gets pushed into rural areas to help support them. Meanwhile, the rural areas don't have as much property tax, so they're taking the more, but oftentimes they're difficult to assess in a similar way to what they do in our more populated regions. Farmland is difficult to raise assessments on, and I understand that. But again, when that happens, you create this kind of a lot of the revenue gets generated in St. Louis and gets dispersed throughout. But when you talk about St. Louis as a region, our property taxes do not get dispersed amongst the region. They remain with the district. So districts that are rich in property continue to receive more in funding than those that are poor in property. And that creates that the disparage between our districts in St. Louis. So
what happened to the foundation formula that's supposed to smooth that out? Well,
it was when they enacted it. I think it was about 2007. They started rolling a new foundation formula, and it was full of promise. And it really had some great mechanisms to increase funding in Missouri. And then we had a recession that hit, and they had to make some decisions. So they decided not to fully fund that formula. Then they made some decisions. And when I say they, the legislature made some decisions about changing what that number is to fully fund the formula. So now we've fully funded the formula, but at a lower rate. As part of that formula, they took into account part of the old formula, part of the new formula. And it's just difficult in a state like Missouri, where you have very, very rural districts that are very small, very, very large, and sometimes rich districts in suburban areas. It's hard to come up with a funding formula that supports both of those and does so in a way that's fair, because you just have some differences in the way they can fund education locally, if that makes sense. So we'd probably have to scrap the foundation formula completely, start from scratch, and try to take into consideration some way to take property taxes, even them out across. And then if a district wants to go beyond that, they have the ability to do that locally, but at least set a threshold where everybody in the state has that minimum amount of property tax that's generated to support their schools.
Dr. Ziegler, pre-DSEG, post-DSEG, pre-COVID, post-COVID, Black kids in every district throughout all the school districts that you serve get lower grades, get worse test scores than white kids do. And this has been going on since I graduated Kirkwood High School in 1978. Everybody talks about we're working on it, but what's getting done on it?
And it is a struggle. And I wish I could point to other than just things that, there's a school that did a wonderful job with kids. Sustaining that progress and support for those districts or those schools where they are is real difficult, because I'll tell you, sometimes we have some great leaders that go into some schools and really make a difference. And oftentimes our affluent schools will often take those leaders too, because they want those great leaders. And we need to figure out ways to encourage our best leaders to stay in some of those places that are the most difficult to serve. We have some wonderful leaders here now that are doing some great things in district, but it takes time, and we don't have time. And that's part of our challenge, is how do we accelerate that progress? Because right now we haven't done it in a way that's meaningful enough to make the difference. And I do think there's some things that we sometimes measure in our state that aren't the most important pieces to measure for kids. But again, we still need to make more progress in some of our low achieving districts, and we struggle. And we haven't figured out a mechanism or a path forward that's really made that difference yet. We have a lot of people working on it. We have a lot of people talking about it, as you said, but we haven't figured out how to make a difference. And that challenge is on us.
I just think from 1978 to 2020, that's enough time.
I agree. And I haven't served during all that, but I agree. We're out of time. We need to figure out some ways to make the difference, and we haven't yet. And all we can do is keep putting our best minds to try and figure out what's going to change. But certainly the pandemic's going to slow that challenge even further, because now we're playing a little catch up, probably from last year and into this year. And that can't be an excuse, but we've got to figure out a way to do it.
Well, an educator in my family who works in Seattle says that is the question for all school districts around the country, and not one has been able to narrow that gap. Not one. Is that your understanding, that performance or achievement gap is throughout the United States? And it's an issue that everybody's working on but can't find an answer for?
Yes, I think certainly across the United States, that is a problem that we identify everywhere. Could I say there's been nobody that makes a difference? No. I think there have been pockets, but sustaining that change, that leadership, that whatever that system is that's going to produce the results, sustaining it seems to be the problem. We've had pockets of greatness, whether it's been at an inner city school or a rural school where they've done dramatic things to change the performance of their children. But over time, sustaining it's been the difficult part, and I don't know what the answer is there.
Dr. Ziegler, there's so many, and this is more along the lines of the family and a personal issue, I think, for these families. We've seen and read so much about young kids who they're overwhelmed with that the online learning. They are not only, their education is being hampered by the online experience, but there's also a growing amount of anxiety with these kids. Do you have you learned anything throughout the pandemic that would maybe help parents give some comfort to their children in this regard?
And I can't speak to every parent, but one thing I have found when I've discussed different things with parents is oftentimes our parents' expectation about what that day would look like for a student on virtual is off a little bit. And by that, I mean, they may be at school 7 hours a day, 8 hours a day, but it is not 8 hours a day of engaged in academic learning for that entire point. If you think about a kindergarten, first grade, second grader, they have recess, they have lunch, they have transition time. And each of those take a portion of that day. And oftentimes I think our parents put so much pressure on themselves and consequently their student by thinking, I've got to have my child engaged in front of that screen or doing something 7 hours a day, 6 hours a day. And realistically, that's not the way it is at school. There's always other transitions and things that are going on that take up some of that time too. And I think they kind of forget that because they think they're out of my care and they're with a teacher that must be all academic, and it's just not. So I think that is one of the things I could give to parents, that they need to take a deep breath and think about, okay, what is realistic for my child? And it may only be 3 hours of engagement during an 8-hour period where they're actually working on a math problem or reading, or because it does make kids tired. And that's why days are designed the way they are with those breaks and transition times. I don't know if that would help everybody, but it's something that I know a few parents have I've seen them pause and go, okay, that makes sense. So.
Doctor, I've got 2 grandchildren in a county school district in Webster Groves. And my daughter tells me that there's a chance that they will be going to regular school, especially one of them is a kindergartner, and that the school district might decide in November maybe, or the 1st of December, to start having kids come to school again, especially the very young ones. What do you hear when you talk to all these district superintendents? What's the feeling on how soon they're going to be able to get kids back into school?
So, and I'm going to base this on St. Louis County because St. Charles County all have some sort of face-to-face, as well as Jefferson County. So I'm going to keep this at St. Louis City, St. Louis County. I would say the majority of the districts have in the works right now a plan to bring kids back to face-to-face. Now, with that said, there's some already engaged in face-to-face. Hancock Place School District, because of its size, because of its resources of facilities, is able to have K-5 back right now, face-to-face, 5 days a week, socially distanced. And they have about 60% of their kids, about 40% of their kids, if I remember correctly, have selected an online or a virtual platform. But those 60% of the kindergarten through 5th graders are coming to school every day, socially distanced, and it seems to be going well based on my conversation. Lindbergh School District has a kind of a hybrid model, but have many of their young ones back, and they're beginning to work towards their hybrid for middle school. So there's enough. So you see all of those. I know Rockwood has had conversations about their K-2, bringing them back and then transit. Mm-hmm. So each district is adopting those plans. I I think Parkway has said they're going to hold off until quarter, which is middle of October. I think each district is now putting out that information about when do they see their children coming back. And I do see it as a kind of a transition, starting with the youngest, working towards middle school, with high school still kind of being a little bit of in a balance to decide when that may be appropriate.
Thank you.
We have 30 seconds to go. Ray, can you ask a quick question for Dr. Ziegler?
What do you want everyone in St. Louis to do for you? I mean, I can't imagine 53 school districts, and to Bill's point, they're not getting on. What can the average St. Louisan, with or without kids in school, be doing to help make this better?
With 15 seconds, Doctor.
Take it as a community effort. We need to wear masks. We need to socially distance. We need to wash our hands. That's the way we can stop the spread and keep our kids in school once they get there. If we can take that on as a community, we can get kids back to school. That's where we want them. Do that as a community and help us get our kids back and keep them back.
Dr. Ziegler, thank you so much for your time, for joining us on the 9 Network, and we wish you and everyone at Education Plus the very best. Thanks so much, and have a great one.
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity.
Donnybrook is made possible by the members of the 9 Network.